Chapter 6. Ivan Ilych saw that he was dying, and he was in continual despair. In the depth of his heart he knew he was dying, but not only was he not accustomed to the thought, he simply did not and could not grasp it. The syllogism he had learnt from Kiesewetta's logic, Caius is a man, men are mortal, therefore Caius is mortal, had always seemed to him correct as applied to Caius, but certainly not as applied to himself. That Caius, man in the abstract, was mortal was perfectly correct, but he was not Caius, not an abstract man, but a creature quite separate from all others. He had been little Vanya, with a mamma and a papa, with Mitya and Volodya, with the toys, a coachman and a nurse, afterwards with Katienka, and with all the joys, griefs and delights of childhood, boyhood and youth. What did Caius know of the smell of that striped leather ball Vanya had been so fond of? Had Caius kissed his mother's hand like that? And did the silk of her dress rustle so for Caius? Had he rioted like that at school when the pastry was bad? Had Caius been in love like that? Could Caius preside at a session as he did? Caius really was mortal, and it was right for him to die, but for me, little Vanya, Ivan Ilych, with all my thoughts and emotions, it's altogether a different matter. It cannot be that I ought to die. That would be too terrible. Such was his feeling. If I had to die like Caius, I would have known it was so. An inner voice would have told me so. But there was nothing of the sort in me, and I and all my friends felt that our case was quite different from that of Caius. And now, here it is, he said to himself. It can't be. It's impossible. But here it is. How is this? How is one to understand it? He could not understand it, and tried to drive this false, incorrect, morbid thought away, and to replace it by other proper and healthy thoughts. But that thought, and not the thought only, but the reality itself, seemed to come and confront him. And to replace that thought, he called up a succession of others, hoping to find in them some support. He tried to get back into the former current of thoughts that had once screened the thought of death from him, but, strange to say, all that had formerly shut off, hidden, and destroyed his consciousness of death no longer had that effect. Ivan Ilych now spent most of his time in attempting to re-establish that old current. He would say to himself, I will take up my duties again. After all, I used to live by them. And banishing all doubts, he would go to the law courts, enter into conversation with his colleagues, and sit carelessly, as was his wont, scanning the crowd with a thoughtful look, and leaning both his emaciated arms on the arms of his oak chair, bending over, as usual, to a colleague, and drawing his papers nearer, he would interchange whispers with him, and then suddenly, raising his eyes and sitting erect, would pronounce certain words and open the proceedings. But suddenly, in the midst of those proceedings, the pain in his side, regardless of the stage the proceedings had reached, would begin its own gnawing work. Ivan Ilych would turn his attention to it and try to drive the thought of it away, but without success. It would come and stand before him and look at him, and he would be petrified, and the light would die out of his eyes, and he would again begin asking himself whether it alone was true. And his colleagues and subordinates would see with surprise and distress that he, the brilliant and subtle judge, was becoming confused and making mistakes. He would shake himself, try to pull himself together, manage somehow to bring the sitting to a close, and return home with the sorrowful consciousness that his judicial labours could not, as formerly, hide from him what he wanted them to hide, and could not deliver him from it. And what was worst of all was that it drew his attention to itself, not in order to make him take some action, but only that he should look at it, look it straight in the face, look at it, and without doing anything, suffer inexpressibly. And to save himself from this condition, Ivan Ilych looked for consolations, new screens, and new screens were found, and for a while seemed to save him. But then they immediately fell to pieces, or rather became transparent, as if it penetrated them, and nothing could veil it. In these latter days he would go into the drawing room he had arranged, that drawing room where he had fallen, and for the sake of which, how bitterly ridiculous it seemed, he had sacrificed his life, for he knew that his illness originated with that knock. He would enter and see that something had scratched the polished table. He would look for the cause of it, and find that it was the bronze ornamentation of an album that had got bent. He would take up the expensive album which he had lovingly arranged, and feel vexed with his daughter and her friends for their untidiness, for the album was torn here and there, and some of the photographs turned upside down. He would put it carefully in order and bend the ornamentation back into position. Then it would occur to him to place all those things in another corner of the room, near the plants. He would call the footman, but his daughter or wife would come to help him. They would not agree, and his wife would contradict him, and he would dispute and grow angry. But that was all right, for then he did not think about it. It was invisible. But then, when he was moving something himself, his wife would say, "Let the servants do it. You will hurt yourself again." And suddenly it would flash through the screen and he would see it. It was just a flash, and he hoped it would disappear, but he would involuntarily pay attention to his side. It sits there as before, gnawing just the same. And he could no longer forget it, but could distinctly see it, looking at him from behind the flowers. What is it all for? It really is so. I lost my life over that curtain, as I might have done when storming a fort. Is that possible? How terrible and how stupid. Can't be true. It can't. But it is. He would go to his study, lie down, and again be alone with it, face to face with it. And nothing could be done with it except to look at it and shudder. Chapter 7. How it happened, it is impossible to say, because it came about step by step, unnoticed. But in the 3rd month of Ivan Ilych's illness, his wife, his daughter, his son, his acquaintances, the doctors, the servants, and above all he himself, were aware that the whole interest he had for other people was whether he would soon vacate his place, and at last release the living from the discomfort caused by his presence, and be himself released from his sufferings. He slept less and less. He was given opium and hypodermic injections of morphine, but this did not relieve him. The dull depression he experienced in a somnolent condition at first gave him a little relief, but only as something new. Afterwards it became as distressing as the pain itself, or even more so. Special foods were prepared for him by the doctor's orders, but all those foods became increasingly distasteful and disgusting to him. For his excretions also special arrangements had to be made, and this was a torment to him every time, a torment from the uncleanliness, the unseemliness, and the smell. and from knowing that another person had to take part in it. But just through this most unpleasant matter, Ivan Ilych obtained comfort. Gerasim, the butler's young assistant, always came in to carry the things out. Gerasim was a clean, fresh peasant lad, grown stout on town food, and always cheerful and bright. At first, the sight of him, in his clean Russian peasant costume, engaged on that disgusting task, embarrassed Ivan Ilych. Once, when he got up from the commode, too weak to draw up his trousers, he dropped into a soft armchair and looked with horror at his bare, enfeebled thighs, with the muscles so sharply marked on them. Gerasim, with a firm, light tread, his heavy boots emitting a pleasant smell of tar and fresh winter air, came in wearing a clean Hessian apron, the sleeves of his print shirt tucked up over his strong, bare young arms, and refraining from looking at his sick master out of consideration for his feelings, and restraining the joy of life that beamed from his face, he went up to the commode. "Gerasim," said Ivan Ilych in a weak voice. Gerasim started, evidently afraid he might have committed some blunder, and with a rapid movement turned his fresh, kind, simple young face, which just showed the first downy signs of a beard. "Yes, sir?" "That must be very unpleasant for you. You must forgive me. I am helpless." "Oh, why, sir?" And Gerasim's eyes beamed and he showed his glistening white teeth. "What's a little trouble? It's a case of illness with you, sir." And his deft, strong hands did their accustomed task, and he went out of the room, stepping lightly. 5 minutes later, he as lightly returned. Ivan Ilych was still sitting in the same position in the armchair. "Gerasim," he said, when the latter had replaced the freshly washed utensil, "please come here and help me." Gerasim went up to him. "Lift me up. It is hard for me to get up, and I have sent Dmitri away." Gerasim went up to him, grasped his master with his strong arms, deftly but gently, in the same way that he stepped, lifted him, supported him with one hand, and with the other drew up his trousers, and would have set him down again, but Ivan Ilych asked to be led to the sofa. Gerasim, without an effort and without apparent pressure, led him, almost lifting him to the sofa, and placed him on it. "Oh, thank you. How easily and well you do it all." Gerasim smiled again and turned to leave the room. But Ivan Ilych felt his presence such a comfort that he did not want to let him go. "One thing more. Please move up that chair. No, the other one, under my feet. It is easier for me when my feet are raised." Gerasim brought the chair, set it down gently in place, and raised Ivan Ilitch's legs on it. It seemed to Ivan Ilych that he felt better while Gerasim was holding up his legs. "It's better when my legs are higher," he said. "Place that cushion under them." Gerasim did so. He again lifted the legs and placed them, and again Ivan Ilych felt better while Gerasim held his legs. When he set them down, Ivan Ilych fancied he felt worse. "Gerasim," he said, "are you busy now?" "Not at all, sir," said Gerasim, who had learnt from the townsfolk how to speak to gentlefolk. "What have you still to do?" What am I to do?" "I've done everything except chopping the logs for tomorrow." "Then hold my legs up a bit higher, can you?" "Of course I can. Why not?" And Gerasim raised his master's legs higher, and Ivan Ilych thought that in that position he did not feel any pain at all. "And how about the logs?" "Don't trouble about that, sir. There's plenty of time." Ivan Ilych told Gerasim to sit down and hold his legs, and began to talk to him. And strange to say, it seemed to him that he felt better while Gerasim held his legs up. After that, Ivan Ilych would sometimes call Gerasim and get him to hold his legs on his shoulders, and he liked talking to him. Gerasim did it all easily, willingly, simply, and with a good nature that touched Ivan Ilych. Health, strength, and vitality in other people were offensive to him, but Gerasim's strength and vitality did not mortify but soothed him. What tormented Ivan Ilych most was the deception, the lie, which for some reason they all accepted, that he was not dying but was simply ill, and he only need keep quiet and undergo a treatment, and then something very good would result. He, however, knew that do what they would, nothing would come of it, only still more agonizing suffering and death. This deception tortured him, their not wishing to admit what they all knew and what he knew, but wanting to lie to him concerning his terrible condition, and wishing and forcing him to participate in that lie. Those lies enacted over him on the eve of his death, and destined to degrade this awful, solemn act to the level of their visitings, their curtains, their sturgeon for dinner, were a terrible agony for Ivan Ilych. And strangely enough, many times when they were going through their antics over him, he had been within a hair-breadth of calling out to them, "Stop lying! You know and I know that I am dying. Then at least stop lying about it." But he had never had the spirit to do it. The awful, terrible act of his dying was, he could see, reduced by those about him to the level of a casual, unpleasant, and almost indecorous incident, as if someone entered a drawing-room diffusing an unpleasant odor, and this was done by that very decorum which he had served all his life long. He saw that no one felt for him, because no one even wished to grasp his position. Only Gerasim recognized it and pitied him, and so Ivan Ilych felt at ease only with him. He felt comforted when Gerasim supported his legs, sometimes all night long, and refused to go to bed, saying, "Don't you worry, Ivan Ilych, I'll get sleep enough later on." Or when he suddenly became familiar and exclaimed, "If you weren't sick, it would be another matter, but as it is, why should I grudge a little trouble?" Gerasim alone did not lie. Everything showed that he alone understood the facts of the case, and did not consider it necessary to disguise them, but simply felt sorry for his emaciated and enfeebled master. Once, when Ivan Ilych was sending him away, he even said straight out, "We shall all of us die, so why should I grudge a little trouble?" expressing the fact that he did not think his work burdensome, because he was doing it for a dying man, and hoped someone would do the same for him when his time came. Apart from this lying, or because of it, what most tormented Ivan Ilych was that no one pitied him as he wished to be pitied. At certain moments, after prolonged suffering, he wished most of all, though he would have been ashamed to confess it, for someone to pity him as a sick child is pitied. He longed to be petted and comforted. He knew he was an important functionary, that he had a beard turning grey, and that therefore what he longed for was impossible, but still he longed for it. And in Gerasim's attitude towards him there was something akin to what he wished for, and so that attitude comforted him. Ivan Ilych wanted to weep, wanted to be petted and cried over, and then his colleague Shebek would come, and instead of weeping and being petted, Ivan Ilych would assume a serious, severe, and profound air, and by force of habit would express his opinion on a decision of the Court of Cassation, and would stubbornly insist on that view. This falsity around him and within him did more than anything else to poison his last days. Chapter 8. It was morning. He knew it was morning because Gerasim had gone, and Pyotr, the footman, had come and put out the candles, drawn back one of the curtains, and begun quietly to tidy up. Whether it was morning or evening, Friday or Sunday, made no difference. It was all just the same. The gnawing, unmitigated, agonizing pain, never ceasing for an instant. The consciousness of life inexorably waning, but not yet extinguished. The approach of that ever-dreaded and hateful death, which was the only reality, and always the same falsity. What were days, weeks, hours in such a case? "Will you have some tea, sir?" He wants things to be regular and wishes the gentlefolk to drink tea in the morning, thought Ivan Ilych, and only said, "No. Wouldn't you like to move on to the sofa, sir?" He wants to tidy up the room, and I'm in the way. I'm uncleanliness and disorder, he thought, and said only, "No, leave me alone." The man went on bustling about. Ivan Ilych stretched out his hand. Pyotr came up, ready to help. "What is it, sir?" "My watch." Pyotr took the watch, which was close at hand, and gave it to his master. 8:30. Are they up?" "No, sir, except Vladimir Ivanovich, the son, who has gone to school. Praskovya Fyodorovna ordered me to wake her if you asked for her. Shall I do so?" "No, there's no need to." Perhaps I'd better have some tea, he thought, and added aloud, "Yes, bring me some tea." Pyotr went to the door, but Ivan Ilych dreaded being left alone. How can I keep him here? Oh, yes, my medicine. "Pyotr, give me my medicine." Why not? Perhaps it may still do some good. He took a spoonful and swallowed it. No, it won't help. It's all tomfoolery, all deception, he decided as soon as he became aware of the familiar, sickly, hopeless taste. No, I can't believe it any longer. But the pain, why this pain? If it would only cease just for a moment. And he moaned. Pyotr turned towards him. "It's all right. Go and fetch me some tea." Pyotr went out. Left alone, Ivan Ilych groaned, not so much with pain, terrible though that was, as from mental anguish. Always and forever the same, always these endless days and nights. If only it would come quicker. If only what would come quicker? Death? Darkness? No, no, anything rather than death. When Pyotr returned with the tea on a tray, Ivan Ilych stared at him for a time in perplexity, not realizing who and what he was. Pyotr was disconcerted by that look, and his embarrassment brought Ivan Ilych to himself. "Oh, tea. All right, put it down. Only help me to wash and put on a clean shirt." And Ivan Ilych began to wash. With pauses for rest, he washed his hands, and then his face, cleaned his teeth, brushed his hair, looked in the glass. He was terrified by what he saw, especially by the limp way in which his hair clung to his pallid forehead. While his shirt was being changed, he knew that he would be still more frightened at the sight of his body, so he avoided looking at it. Finally, he was ready. He drew on a dressing gown, wrapped himself in a plaid, and sat down in the armchair to take his tea. For a moment he felt refreshed, But as soon as he began to drink the tea, he was again aware of the same taste, and the pain also returned. He finished it with an effort, and then lay down, stretching out his legs, and dismissed Pyotr. Always the same. Now a spark of hope flashes up, then a sea of despair rages, and always pain, always pain, always despair, and always the same. When alone, he had a dreadful and distressing desire to call someone, but he knew beforehand that with others present it would be still worse. Another dose of morphine to lose consciousness. I will tell him, the doctor, that he must think of something else. It's impossible to go on like this. An hour and another pass like that. But now there is a ring at the doorbell. Perhaps it's the doctor. It is. He comes in, fresh, hearty, plump and cheerful, with that look on his face that seems to say, "There now, you're in a panic about something, but we'll arrange it all for you directly." The doctor knows this expression is out of place here, but he has put it on once for all and can't take it off, like a man who has put on a frock coat in the morning to pay a round of calls. The doctor rubs his hands vigorously and reassuringly. "Oh, how cold it is! Such a sharp frost. Just let me warm myself," he says, as if it were only a matter of waiting till he was warm, and then he would put everything right. "Well now, how are you?" Ivan Ilych feels that the doctor would like to say, "Well, how are our affairs?" but that even he feels that this would not do, and says instead, "What sort of a night have you had?" Ivan Ilych looks at him as much as to say, "Are you really never ashamed of lying?" But the doctor does not wish to understand this question, and Ivan Ilych says, "Just as terrible as ever. The pain never leaves me and never subsides. If only something—" "Yes, you sick people are always like that. There, now I think I'm warm enough. Even Praskovya Fyodorovna, who is so particular, could find no fault with my temperature. Well, now I can say good morning." And the doctor presses his patient's hand. Then, dropping his former playfulness, he begins with a most serious face to examine the patient, feeling his pulse and taking his temperature, and then begins the sounding and auscultation. Ivan Ilych knows quite well and definitely that all this is nonsense and pure deception, but when the doctor, getting down on his knee, leans over him, putting his ear first higher, then lower, and performs various gymnastic movements over him with a significant expression on his face, Ivan Ilych submits to it all as he used to submit to the speeches of the lawyers, though he knew very well that they were all lying and why they were lying. The doctor, kneeling on the sofa, is still sounding him when Praskovya Fyodorovna's silk dress rustles at the door, and she is heard scolding Pyotr for not having let her know the doctor's arrival. She comes in, kisses her husband, and at once proceeds to prove that she has been up a long time already, and only owing to a misunderstanding failed to be there when the doctor arrived. Ivan Ilych looks at her, scans her all over, sets against her the whiteness and plumpness and cleanness of her hands and neck, the gloss of her hair, and the sparkle of her vivacious eyes. He hates her with his whole soul, and the thrill of hatred he feels for her makes him suffer from her touch. Her attitude towards him and his diseases is still the same. Just as the doctor had adopted a certain relation to his patient which he could not abandon, so had she formed one towards him, that he was not doing something he ought to do, and was himself to blame, and that she reproached him lovingly for this, and she could not now change that attitude. "You see, he doesn't listen to me, and doesn't take his medicine at the proper time. and above all, he lies in a position that is no doubt bad for him, with his legs up." She described how he made Gerasim hold his legs up. The doctor smiled with a contemptuous affability that said, "What's to be done? These sick people do have foolish fancies of that kind, but we must forgive them." When the examination was over, the doctor looked at his watch, and then Praskovya Fyodorovna announced to Ivan Ilych that it was, of course, as he pleased, but she had sent today for a celebrated specialist who would examine him and have a consultation with Mikhail Danilovich, their regular doctor. "Please don't raise any objections. I am doing this for my own sake," she said, ironically, letting it be felt that she was doing it all for his sake, and only said this to leave him no right to refuse. He remained silent, knitting his brows. He felt that he was surrounded and involved in a mesh of falsity that it was hard to unravel anything. Everything she did for him was entirely for her own sake, and she told him she was doing for herself what she actually was doing for herself, as if that was so incredible that he must understand the opposite. At 11:30, the celebrated specialist arrived. Again the sounding began, and the significant conversations in his presence and in another room about the kidneys and the appendix and the questions and answers, with such an air of importance that again, instead of the real question of life and death, which now alone confronted him, the question arose of the kidney and appendix, which were not behaving as they ought to, and would now be attached by Mikhail Danilovich and the specialist and forced to amend their ways. The celebrated specialist took leave of him with a serious, though not hopeless look, and in reply to the timid question, Ivan Ilych, with eyes glistening with fear and hope, put to him as to whether there was a chance of recovery, said that he could not vouch for it, but there was a possibility. The look of hope with which Ivan Ilych watched the doctor out was so pathetic that Praskovya Fyodorovna, seeing it, even wept as she left the room to hand the doctor his fee. The gleam of hope kindled by the doctor's encouragement did not last long. The same room, the same pictures, curtains, wallpaper, medicine bottles were all there, and the same aching, suffering body, and Ivan Ilych began to moan. They gave him a subcutaneous injection, and he sank into oblivion. It was twilight when he came to. They brought him his dinner, and he swallowed some beef tea with difficulty, and then everything was the same again, and night was coming on. After dinner, at 7 o'clock, Praskovya Fyodorovna came into the room in evening dress, her full bosom pushed up by her corset and with traces of powder on her face. She had reminded him in the morning that they were going to the theatre. Sarah Bernhardt was visiting the town, and they had a box which he had insisted on their taking. Now he had forgotten about it, and her toilet offended him, but he concealed his vexation when he remembered that he had himself insisted on their securing a box and going, because it would be an instructive and aesthetic pleasure for the children. Praskovya Fyodorovna came in, self-satisfied, but yet with a rather guilty air. She sat down and asked how he was, but, as he saw, only for the sake of asking, and not in order to learn about it, knowing that there was nothing to learn, and then went on to what she really wanted to say, that she would not on any account have gone, but that the box had been taken, and Helen and their daughter were going, as well as Petrishchev, the examining magistrate, their daughter's fiancé, and that it was out of the question to let them go alone, but that she would have much preferred to sit with him for a while, and he must be sure to follow the doctor's orders while she was away. Oh, and Fyodor Petrovitch, the fiancé, would like to come in. May he? And Lisa? All right. Their daughter came in full evening dress, her fresh young flesh exposed, making a show of that very flesh which in his own case caused so much suffering, strong, healthy, evidently in love, and impatient with illness, suffering, and death, because they interfered with her happiness. Fyodor Petrovitch came in too in evening dress, his hair curled à la Capoul, a tight, stiff collar around his long, sinewy neck, an enormous white shirt front, and narrow black trousers tightly stretched over his strong thighs. He had one white glove tightly drawn on, and was holding his opera hat in his hand. Following him, the schoolboy crept in unnoticed, in a new uniform, poor little fellow, and wearing gloves. Terribly dark shadows showed under his eyes, the meaning of which Ivan Ilych knew well. His son had always seemed pathetic to him, and now it was dreadful to see the boy's frightened look of pity. It seemed to Ivan Ilych that Vasya was the only one besides Gerasim who understood and pitied him. They all sat down and again asked how he was. A silence followed. Lisa asked her mother about the opera glasses, and there was an altercation between mother and daughter as to who had taken them and where they had been put. This occasioned some unpleasantness. Fyodor Petrovitch inquired of Ivan Ilych whether he had ever seen Sarah Bernhardt. Ivan Ilych did not at first catch the question, but then replied, "No. Have you seen her before?" "Yes, in Adrian Lecouvreur." Praskovia Fyodorovna mentioned some roles in which Sarah Bernhardt was particularly good. Her daughter disagreed. Conversation sprang up as to the elegance and realism of her acting, the sort of conversation that is always repeated and is always the same. In the midst of the conversation, Fyodor Petrovitch glanced at Ivan Ilych and became silent. The others also looked at him and grew silent. Ivan Ilych was staring with glittering eyes straight before him, evidently indignant with them. This had to be rectified, but it was impossible to do so. The silence had to be broken, but for a time no one dared to break it, and they all became afraid that the conventional deception would suddenly become obvious and the truth become plain to all. Lisa was the first to pluck up courage and break that silence, but by trying to hide what everybody was feeling, she betrayed it. "Well, if we're going, it's time to start," she said, looking at her watch, a present from her father, and with a faint and significant smile at Fyodor Petrovitch, relating to something known only to them, she got up with a rustle of her dress. They all rose, said good night, and went away. When they had gone, it seemed to Ivan Ilych that he felt better. The falsity had gone with them. But the pain remained, that same pain and that same fear that made everything monotonously alike, nothing harder and nothing easier. Everything was worse. Again, minute followed minute, and hour followed hour. Everything remained the same, and there was no cessation. And the inevitable end of it all became more and more terrible. "Yes, send Gerasim here," he replied to a question Pyotr asked. Chapter 9. His wife returned late at night. She came in on tiptoe, but he heard her, opened his eyes, and made haste to close them again. She wished to send Gerasim away and to sit with him herself, but he opened his eyes and said, "No, go away." "Are you in great pain?" "Always the same." "Take some opium." He agreed and took some. She went away. Till about 3 in the morning he was in a state of stupefied misery. It seemed to him that he and his pain were being thrust into a narrow, deep black sack. But though they were pushed further and further in, they could not be pushed to the bottom. And this, terrible enough in itself, was accompanied by suffering. He was frightened, yet wanted to fall through the sack. He struggled, but yet cooperated. And suddenly he broke through, fell, and regained consciousness. Gerasim was sitting at the foot of the bed, dozing quietly and patiently, while he himself lay with his emaciated, stockinged legs resting on Gerasim's shoulders. The same shaded candle was there, and the same unceasing pain. "Go away, Gerasim," he whispered. "Oh, it's all right, sir. I'll stay a while." "No, go away." He removed his legs from Gerasim's shoulders, turned sideways onto his arm, and felt sorry for himself. He only waited till Gerasim had gone into the next room, and then restrained himself no longer, but wept like a child. He wept on account of his helplessness, his terrible loneliness, the cruelty of man, the cruelty of God, and the absence of God. "Why hast thou done all this? Why hast thou brought me here? Why dost thou torment me so terribly?" He did not expect an answer, and yet wept because there was no answer and could be none. The pain again grew more acute, but he did not stir and did not call. He said to himself, "Go on, strike me. But what is it for? What have I done to thee? What is it for?" Then he grew quiet, and not only ceased weeping, but even held his breath and became all attention. It was as though he were listening not to an audible voice, but to the voice of his soul, to the current of thoughts arising within him. "What is it you want?" was the first clear conception capable of expression in words that he heard. "What do you want? What do you want?" he repeated to himself. "What do I want? To live and not to suffer," he answered. And again he listened with such concentrated attention that even his pain did not distract him. "To live? How?" asked his inner voice. "Why, to live as I used to, well and pleasantly." "As you lived before, well and pleasantly?" the voice repeated. And in imagination he began to recall the best moments of his pleasant life. But strange to say, none of those best moments of his pleasant life now seemed at all what they had then seemed. None of them except the first recollections of childhood. There, in childhood, there had been something really pleasant, with which it would be possible to live if it could return. But the child who had experienced that happiness existed no longer. It was like a reminiscence of somebody else. As soon as the period began which had produced the present Ivan Ilych, all that had then seemed joys now melted before his sight and turned into something trivial and often nasty. And the further he departed from childhood and the nearer he came to the present, the more worthless and doubtful were the joys. This began with the school of law. A little that was really good was still found there. There was light-heartedness, friendship, and hope. But in the upper classes there had already been fewer of such good moments. Then, during the first years of his official career, when he was in the service of the governor, some pleasant moments again occurred. They were the memories of love for a woman. Then all became confused, and there was still less of what was good. Later on again, there was still less that was good, and the further he went, the less there was. His marriage, a mere accident, then the disenchantment that followed it, his wife's bad breath and the sensuality and hypocrisy, then that deadly official life and those preoccupations about money, a year of it, and 2, and 10, and 20, and always the same thing. And the longer it lasted, the more deadly it became. It is as if I'd been going downhill while I imagined I was going up. And that is really what it was. I was going up in public opinion, but to the same extent life was ebbing away from me. And now it is all done and there is only death. Then what does it mean? Why? It can't be that life is so senseless and horrible. But if it really has been so horrible and senseless, why must I die, and die in agony? There is something wrong. Maybe I did not live as I ought to have done, it suddenly occurred to him. But how could that be, when I did everything properly? He replied, and immediately dismissed from his mind this, the sole solution of all the riddles of life and death, as something quite impossible. Then what do you want now? To live? Live how? Live as you lived in the law courts when the usher proclaimed, "The judge is coming. The judge is coming. The judge," he repeated to himself. "Here he is, the judge. But I am not guilty," he exclaimed angrily. "What is it for?" And he ceased crying, but turning his face to the wall, continued to ponder on the same question. Why, and for what purpose, is there all this horror? But, however much he pondered, he found no answer, and whenever the thought occurred to him, as it often did, that it all resulted from his not having lived as he ought to have done, he at once recalled the correctness of his whole life and dismissed so strange an idea. Chapter 10. Another fortnight passed. Ivan Ilych now no longer left his sofa. He would not lie in bed, but lay on the sofa, facing the wall nearly all the time. He suffered ever the same unceasing agonies, and in his loneliness pondered always on the same insoluble question. What is this? Can it be that it is death? And the inner voice answered, "Yes, it is death." "Why these sufferings?" And the voice answered, "For no reason. They just are so." Beyond and besides this, there was nothing. From the very beginning of his illness, ever since he had first been to see the doctor, Ivan Ilych's life had been divided between two contrary and alternating moods. Now it was despair and the expectation of this uncomprehended and terrible death, and now hope and an intently interested observation of the functioning of his organs. Now, before his eyes, there was only a kidney or an intestine that temporarily evaded its duty, and now only that incomprehensible and dreadful death from which it was impossible to escape. These two states of mind had alternated from the very beginning of his illness, but the further it progressed, the more doubtful and fantastic became the conception of the kidney, and the more real the sense of impending death. He had but to call to mind what he had been 3 months before and what he was now, to call to mind with what regularity he had been going downhill, for every possibility of hope to be shattered. Latterly, during the loneliness in which he found himself as he lay facing the back of the sofa, a loneliness in the midst of a populous town and surrounded by numerous acquaintances and relations, but that yet could not have been more complete anywhere, either at the bottom of the sea or under the earth, during that terrible loneliness, Ivan Ilych had lived only in memories of the past. Pictures of his past rose before him one after another. They always began with what was nearest in time, and then went back to what was most remote, to his childhood, and rested there. If he thought of the stewed prunes that had been offered him that day, his mind went back to the raw, shriveled French plums of his childhood, their peculiar flavour and the flow of saliva when he sucked their stones. And along with the memory of that taste came a whole series of memories of those days, his nurse, his brother, and their toys. "No, I mustn't think of that. It is too painful," Ivan Ilych said to himself, and brought himself back to the present, to the button on the back of the sofa and the creases in its morocco. Morocco is expensive, but it does not wear well. There had been a quarrel about it. It was a different kind of quarrel and a different kind of morocco that time when we tore Father's portfolio and were punished, and Mamma brought us some tarts. And again his thoughts dwelt on his childhood, and again it was painful, and he tried to banish them and fix his mind on something else. Then again, together with that chain of memories, another series passed through his mind, of how his illness had progressed and grown worse. There also, the further back he looked, the more life there had been. There had been more of what was good in life, and more of life itself. The two merged together. Just as the pain went on getting worse and worse, so my life grew worse and worse, he thought. There is one bright spot there at the back, at the beginning of life, and afterwards all becomes blacker and blacker and proceeds more and more rapidly in inverse ratio to the square of the distance from death, thought Ivan Ilych, and the example of a stone falling downwards with increasing velocity entered his mind. Life, a series of increasing sufferings, flies further and further towards its end, the most terrible suffering. "I am flying." He shuddered, shifted himself, and tried to resist, but was already aware that resistance was impossible, and again, with eyes weary of gazing but unable to cease seeing what was before them, he stared at the back of the sofa and waited, awaiting that dreadful fall and shock and destruction. "Resistance is impossible," he said to himself. "If I could only understand what it is all for. But that too is impossible. An explanation would be possible if it could be said that I have not lived as I ought to, but it is impossible to say that." And he remembered all the legality, correctitude, and propriety of his life. "That, at any rate, can certainly not be admitted," he thought, and his lips smiled ironically, as if someone could see that smile and be taken in by it. "There is no explanation. Agony, death, what for?" Chapter 11. Another 2 weeks went by in this way, and during that fortnight an event occurred that Ivan Ilych and his wife had desired. Petrishchev formally proposed. It happened in the evening. The next day, Praskovya Fyodorovna came into her husband's room, considering how best to inform him of it. But that very night there had been a fresh change for the worse in his condition. She found him still lying on the sofa, but in a different position. He lay on his back, groaning and staring fixedly straight in front of him. She began to remind him of his medicines, but he turned his eyes towards her with such a look that she did not finish what she was saying. So great an animosity, to her in particular, did that look express. "For Christ's sake, let me die in peace," he said. She would have gone away, but just then their daughter came in and went up to say good morning. He looked at her as he had done at his wife, and in reply to her inquiry about his health, said dryly that he would soon free them all of himself. They were both silent, and after sitting with him for a while, went away. "Is it our fault?" Lisa said to her mother. "It's as if we were to blame. I am sorry for Papa, but why should we be tortured?" The doctor came at his usual time. Ivan Ilych answered yes and no, never taking his angry eyes from him, and at last said, "You know you can do nothing for me, so leave me alone. We can ease your sufferings. You can't even do that. Let me be." The doctor went into the drawing-room and told Praskovya Fyodorovna that the case was very serious and that the only resource left was opium to allay her husband's sufferings, which must be terrible. It was true, as the doctor said, that Ivan Ilych's physical sufferings were terrible, but worse than the physical sufferings were his mental sufferings, which were his chief torture. His mental sufferings were due to the fact that night, as he looked at Gerasim's sleepy, good-natured face with its prominent cheekbones, the question suddenly occurred to him, "What if my whole life has been wrong?" It occurred to him that what had appeared perfectly impossible before, namely that he had not spent his life as he should have done, might, after all, be true. It occurred to him that his scarcely perceptible attempts to struggle against what was considered good by the most highly placed people, those scarcely noticeable impulses which he had immediately suppressed, might have been the real thing, and all the rest false. And his professional duties and the whole arrangement of his life and of his family and all his social and official interests might all have been false. He tried to defend all those things to himself and suddenly felt the weakness of what he was defending. There was nothing to defend. "But if that is so," he said to himself, "and I am leaving this life with the consciousness that I have lost all that was given me, and it is impossible to rectify it, what then?" He lay on his back and began to pass his life in review in quite a new way. In the morning, when he saw first his footman, then his wife, then his daughter, and then the doctor, their every word and movement confirmed to him the awful truth that had been revealed to him during the night. In them he saw himself, all that for which he had lived, and saw clearly that it was not real at all, but a terrible and huge deception which had hidden both life and death. This consciousness intensified his physical suffering tenfold. He groaned and tossed about and pulled at his clothing, which choked and stifled him, and he hated them on that account. He was given a large dose of opium and became unconscious, but at noon his sufferings began again. He drove everybody away and tossed from side to side. His wife came to him and said, "Jean, my dear, do this for me. It can't do any harm and often helps. Healthy people often do it." He opened his eyes wide. "What?
Take communion. Why? It's unnecessary. However, she began to cry.
Yes, do, my dear. I'll send for our priest. He is such a nice man.
All right. Very well, he muttered.
When the priest came and heard his confession, Ivan Ilych was softened and seemed to feel a relief from his doubts and consequently from his sufferings, and for a moment there came a ray of hope. He again began to think of the vermiform appendix and the possibility of correcting it. He received the sacrament with tears in his eyes. When they laid him down again afterwards, he felt a moment's ease, and the hope that he might live awoke in him again. He began to think of the operation that had been suggested to him.
To live! I want to live,
he said to himself. His wife came in to congratulate him after his communion, and when uttering the usual conventional words, she added, "You feel better, don't you?" Without looking at her, he said,
"Yes."
Her dress, her figure, the expression of her face, the tone of her voice, all revealed the same thing.
This is wrong. It is not as it should be. All you have lived for and still live for is falsehood and deception, hiding life and death from you.
And as soon as he admitted that thought, his hatred and his agonizing physical suffering again sprang up, and with that suffering a consciousness of the unavoidable approaching end. And to this was added a new sensation of grinding, shooting pain and a feeling of suffocation. The expression of his face when he uttered that "yes" was dreadful. Having uttered it, he looked her straight in the eyes, turned on his face with a rapidity extraordinary in his weak state, and shouted,
"Go away! Go away and leave me alone!"
Chapter 12. From that moment, the screaming began that continued for 3 days, and was so terrible that one could not hear it through 2 closed doors without horror. At the moment he answered, his wife realized that he was lost, that there was no return, that the end had come, the very end, and his doubts were still unsolved and remained doubts.
"Oh, oh, oh,"
he cried in various intonations. He had begun by screaming, "I won't," and continued screaming on the letter, "Oh." For 3 whole days, during which time did not exist for him, he struggled in that black sack into which he was being thrust by an invisible, resistless force. He struggled as a man condemned to death struggles in the hand of the executioner, knowing that he cannot save himself. And every moment he felt that, despite all his efforts, he was drawing nearer and nearer to what terrified him. He felt that his agony was due to his being thrust into that black hole, and still more to his not being able to get right into it. He was hindered from getting into it by his conviction that his life had been a good one. That very justification of his life held him fast and prevented his moving forward, and it caused him most torment of all. Suddenly, some force struck him in the chest and side, making it still harder to breathe, and he fell through the hole, and there at the bottom was a light. What had happened to him was like the sensation one sometimes experiences in a railway carriage when one thinks one is going backwards while one is really going forwards, and suddenly becomes aware of the real direction.
"Yes, it was not the right thing," he said to himself, "but that's no matter. It can be done. But what is the right thing?
He asked himself, and suddenly grew quiet. This occurred at the end of the third day, 2 hours before his death. Just then his schoolboy son had crept softly in and gone up to the bedside. The dying man was still screaming desperately and waving his arms. His hand fell on the boy's head, and the boy caught it, pressed it to his lips, and began to cry. At that very moment, Ivan Ilych fell through and caught sight of the light. And it was revealed to him that though his life had not been what it should have been, this could still be rectified.
He asked himself, "What is the right thing?"
and grew still, listening. Then he felt that someone was kissing his hand. He opened his eyes, looked at his son, and felt sorry for him. His wife came up to him, and he glanced at her. She was gazing at him, open-mouthed, with undried tears on her nose and cheek, and a despairing look on her face. He felt sorry for her too.
"Yes, I am making them wretched," he thought. "They are sorry, but it will be better for them when I die."
He wished to say this, but had not the strength to utter it.
"Besides, why speak? I must act," he thought.
With a look at his wife, he indicated his son and said,
"Take him away. Sorry for him. Sorry for you too."
He tried to add, "Forgive me," but said,
"Forgo,"
and waved his hand, knowing that he whose understanding mattered would understand. And suddenly it grew clear to him that what had been oppressing him and would not leave him was all dropping away at once from 2 sides, from 10 sides, and from all sides. He was sorry for them. He must act so as not to hurt them, release them, and free himself from these sufferings.
"How good and how simple," he thought. "And the pain?" he asked himself. "What has become of it? Where are you, pain?"
He turned his attention to it.
"Yes, here it is. Well, what of it? Let the pain be. And death? Where is it?"
He sought his former accustomed fear of death and did not find it.
"Where is it? What death?"
There was no fear because there was no death. In place of death, there was light.
"So that's what it is,"
he suddenly exclaimed aloud.
"What joy!"
To him, all this happened in a single instant, and the meaning of that instant did not change. For those present, his agony continued for another 2 hours. Something rattled in his throat, his emaciated body twitched, then the gasping and rattle became less and less frequent. "It is finished," said someone near him. He heard these words and repeated them in his soul.
"Death is finished,"
he said to himself.
"It is no more."
He drew in a breath, stopped in the midst of a sigh, stretched out, and died. The Death of Ivan Ilych by Leo Tolstoy. Read by Oliver Ford Davis. Chapter 1. During an interval in the Melvinsky trial in the large building of the law courts, the members and public prosecutor met in Ivan Egorovich Shebek's private room, where the conversation turned on the celebrated Krasovsky case. Fyodor Vasilyevich warmly maintained that it was not subject to their jurisdiction. Ivan Egorovich maintained the contrary, while Pyotr Ivanovich, not having entered into the discussion at the start, took no part in it, but looked through the Gazette, which had just been handed in. "Gentlemen," he said, "Ivan Ilych has died." "You don't say so." "Here, read it yourself," replied Pyotr Ivanovich, handing Fyodor Vasilyevich the paper still damp from the press. Surrounded by a black border were the words, "Praskovia Fyodorovna Golovina, with profound sorrow, informs relatives and friends of the demise of her beloved husband, Ivan Ilych Golovin, member of the Court of Justice, which occurred on February the 4th of this year, 1882. The funeral will take place on Friday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon." Ivan Ilych had been a colleague of the gentlemen present and was liked by them all. He had been ill for some weeks with an illness said to be incurable. His post had been kept open for him, but there had been conjectures that in case of his death, Alexeyev might receive his appointment, and that either Vinnikov or Stabel would succeed Alexeyev. So, on receiving the news of Ivan Ilyich's death, the first thought of each of the gentlemen in that private room was of the changes and promotions it might occasion among themselves or their acquaintances. "I shall be sure to get Stabel's place or Vinnikov's," thought Fyodor Vasilyevich. "I was promised that long ago, and the promotion means an extra 800 rubles a year for me, besides the allowance. Now, I must apply for my brother-in-law's transfer from Kaluga," thought Pyotr Ivanovich. "My wife will be very glad, and then she won't be able to say that I never do anything for her relations." "I thought he would never leave his bed again," said Pyotr Ivanovich aloud. "It's very sad." But what really was the matter with him? The doctors couldn't say. At least they could, but each of them said something different. When I last saw him, I thought he was getting better. And I haven't been to see him since the holidays. I always meant to go. Had he any property? I think his wife had a little, but something quite trifling. We shall have to go and see her, but they live so terribly far away. Far away from you, you mean? Everything's far away from your place. You see, he never can forgive my living on the other side of the river, said Pyotr Ivanovich, smiling at Shebek. Then, still talking of the distances between different parts of the city, they returned to the court. Besides considerations as to the possible transfers and promotions likely to result from Ivan Ilyich's death, the mere fact of the death of a near acquaintance aroused, as usual, in all who heard of it, the complacent feeling that it is he who is dead and not I. Each one thought or felt, well, he's dead, but I'm alive. But the more intimate of Ivan Ilyich's acquaintances, his so-called friends, could not help thinking also that they would now have to fulfill the very tiresome demands of propriety by attending the funeral service and paying a visit of condolence to the widow. Fyodor Vasilyevich and Pyotr Ivanovich had been his nearest acquaintances. Pyotr Ivanovich had studied law with Ivan Ilych and had considered himself to be under obligations to him. Having told his wife at dinner-time of Ivan Ilyich's death, and of his conjecture that it might be possible to get her brother transferred to their circuit, Pyotr Ivanovich sacrificed his usual nap, put on his evening clothes, and drove to Ivan Ilyich's house. At the entrance stood a carriage and 2 cabs. Leaning against the wall in the hall downstairs near the cloak stand was a coffin lid covered with cloth of gold, ornamented with gold cord and tassels that had been polished up with metal powder. 2 ladies in black were taking off their fur cloaks. Pyotr Ivanovitch recognized one of them as Ivan Ilych's sister, but the other was a stranger to him. His colleague, Schwartz, was just coming downstairs, but on seeing Pyotr Ivanovitch enter, he stopped and winked at him, as if to say, "Ivan Ilyich has made a mess of things, not like you and me." Schwartz's face, with his Piccadilly whiskers and his slim figure in evening dress, had, as usual, an air of elegant solemnity, which contrasted with the playfulness of his character, and had a special piquancy here, or so it seemed to Pyotr Ivanovitch. Pyotr Ivanovitch allowed the ladies to precede him and slowly followed them upstairs. Schwartz did not come down, but remained where he was, and Pyotr Ivanovitch understood that he wanted to arrange where they should play bridge that evening. The ladies went upstairs to the widow's room, and Schwartz, with seriously compressed lips, but with a playful look in his eyes, indicated by a twist of his eyebrows the room to the right where the body lay. Pyotr Ivanovitch, like everyone else on such occasions, entered feeling uncertain what he would have to do. All he knew was that at such times it is always safe to cross oneself, but he was not quite sure whether one should make obeisances while doing so. He therefore adopted a middle course. On entering the room, he began crossing himself and made a slight movement resembling a bow. At the same time, as far as the motion of his head and arm allowed, he surveyed the room. 2 young men, apparently nephews, one of whom was a high school pupil, were leaving the room, crossing themselves as they did so. An old woman was standing motionless, and a lady with strangely arched eyebrows was saying something to her in a whisper. A vigorous, resolute church reader in a frock coat was reading something in a loud voice with an expression that precluded any contradiction. The butler's assistant, Gerasim, stepping lightly in front of Pyotr Ivanovitch, was strewing something on the floor. Noticing this, Pyotr Ivanovitch was immediately aware of a faint odour of a decomposing body. The last time he had called on Ivan Ilyich, Pyotr Ivanovitch had seen Gerasim in the study. Ivan Ilyich had been particularly fond of him, and he was performing the duty of a sick nurse. Pyotr Ivanovitch continued to make the sign of the cross, slightly inclining his head in an intermediate direction between the coffin, the reader, and the icons on the table in a corner of the room. Afterwards, when it seemed to him that this movement of his arm in crossing himself had gone on too long, he stopped and began to look at the corpse. The dead man lay, as dead men always lie, in a specially heavy way, his rigid limbs sunk in the soft cushions of the coffin, with the head forever bowed on the pillow. His yellow, waxen brow, with bald patches over his sunken temples, was thrust up in the way peculiar to the dead, the protruding nose seeming to press on the upper lip. He was much changed, and grown even thinner since Pyotr Ivanovitch had last seen him. But as is always the case with the dead, his face was handsomer, and above all more dignified than when he was alive. The expression on the face